Sometimes that kind of blues will make you even kill one another or do anything. That kind of love, it goes in. That's where the blues started. It ain't on this side, it's over here.
Welcome to a very special episode of Heavy Metal 101. John, beloved bosom buddy o' mine, I bring what I can only imagine will be for you glad tidings. This is going to be the very first episode of Heavy Metal 101 in which we don't actually talk too terribly much about heavy metal. I would think that would make you happy, but I'm sensing that's not the case.
Well, Eric, I can't wait for you to sell me on what it is we're going to talk about today on the Heavy Metal Podcast.
Okay, so I do need to convince you. There's a bit of a burden of proof. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, normally I'd find not talking about heavy metal incredibly distressing, but I'm actually quite excited to have this opportunity to prove to you the important connection between the blues and heavy metal, the single most important ancestor of our beloved metal, in my opinion. It's the original devil's music. It's the goddamn motherfucking blues. Now, John, I know that you don't tend to like things.
That is accurate.
Okay? I do have a question for you. Coming into this, what sorts of thoughts might you have had about this wonderful musical innovation which emerged out of the Black American population of the mid-19th century, the blues?
I'm generally a fan of the blues.
Ah, so you like the blues.
I do.
You just don't like me.
Well, no, I think you're great,
Oh,
Eric.
okay. Good.
I don't, as of yet, see the podcasterly value of us discussing the blues on a heavy metal podcast.
Well, I aim to spend the next 6.5 hours convincing you otherwise.
Like an 80-page script, y'all.
Well, would you say that you're reasonably well-versed in the history and the repertoire of the blues?
Ooh, no, I would not make that bold a claim. I would say I like the blues.
Okay.
I would not say that I am scholarly
Okay,
informed
you've never
about
really
the blues.
dug in. You just
No, I don't read. We've been over this.
That's fair. We'll get into the serious details over the course of this episode, but what did you think, broadly speaking, of the mostly blues history playlist that I made for you in preparation?
I mean, broadly speaking, I found it enjoyable. I mean, Robert Johnson featured heavily, and I'm a big fan of Robert Johnson. I'm a big fan of Muddy Waters, who made an appearance. There were some pieces on there that felt more like historical records, akin to the recordings I imagine Bartok made when he was going around recording folk tunes, rather than like...
You and your esoteric references.
Okay, Bartok recording folk tunes may be esoteric to our audience, but you know that is well-documented musicology in the field that you and I studied.
Heavy metal studies?
You have not formally studied that, sir. You grew up in the Western classical music tradition and do not try to pretend as anything other than.
Yes, Bela Bartok went through Eastern Europe recording music of the folk and all that stuff. It's true, and a lot of these historic blues recordings, especially the country blues, they are akin to that.
So as a historical record, I find them interesting and valid in terms of like entertainment value, maybe not so much for me.
Well, here in America, I think we can both agree, it really does all come back to the blues, right? It's really at the cornerstone of many of our uniquely American musical traditions.
That's fair.
Okay. Without the blues, we'd have no jazz, no rock and roll, and no heavy metal. And I think the world would be a much less pleasant place to be in. I mean, I could probably live without the jazz, but no heavy metal.
Fuck jazz.
Fuck jazz. But seriously, could you imagine a world with no heavy metal? What would we be doing right now?
I would be working on the actual work that I have to do.
The sad state of affairs that would be. So I'm curious, when I say the blues, who or what first springs to your mind?
It's Robert Johnson for me.
I completely concur. For me as well, it always goes back to the one and only Robert, King of the Delta Blues Johnson, the granddaddy of basically all of the good music. John, so you're a Robert Johnson fan.
I am.
When did you come across Robert Johnson?
So I came to Robert Johnson in a very, very roundabout way. I came to him through Eric Clapton's album, Me and Mr. Johnson.
Oh, okay. So not Cream's Crossroad Blues.
No. I mean, I knew that. I didn't make the connection to Robert Johnson then, but when I was in middle or high school, I got Me and Mr. Johnson and listened to that and loved that, and then realized that these were all just covers from someone else, and then went down that rabbit hole.
I suspect it's actually not that uncommon for Eric Clapton to have introduced people of now many generations actually to Robert Johnson. I think that's a not unusual connection. When I set about writing this episode, I first considered framing it in much the same way I framed our Season 1 Roots of Metal episode, in which we sort of alternated back and forth between heavy metal songs and classical pieces in that case.
Oh my God, I forgot we did that. Total waste of time, too.
Which by the end of, I recall you saying, like, okay, accepting.
You can recall whatever you want. I have literally no memory of it.
I have audio documentation. I have a record.
I'm glad there's a record.
Yes. That was intended as a sort of proof of concept for those dolts out there like you, John, who might previously not have understood the very clear and important connection between classical music and heavy metal. In this case, however, despite your concerns, I would say that heavy metal is so very and obviously indebted
there's definitely
to the
a
blues.
stronger connection between this than this and Western classical music. I will grant you that.
I think that's a fair point, and I do agree. And because of that, because of this very fundamental connection that sort of like threads its way through basically all elements of metal, I thought it might be more valuable to our listeners to spend our precious time drinking deeply from the source and listening to some of the extraordinary freaking body of work that seeded the ground from which would spring beautiful, bountiful heavy metal. Now, John, you're fond of seeding the ground, no?
I don't even have a witty response to that. That question caught me so off guard. In no way was I thinking that's where this was going to end up.
Yes. Regardless, we're going to get to take a scenic, magical mystery tour through the early history of 20th century blues. So are you excited about that?
Sure.
That's exciting. He's just thinking about seeding the ground. You can keep thinking about that. It's good. It'll get you in the blues frame of mind. All right, so let's do this. As you can quite possibly imagine, the earliest origins of the blues weren't terribly well documented. A more or less general consensus is that the genre emerged in the American South sometime in the second half of the 19th century. Personally, I'm fairly certain that the voodoo deity Legba played an important role in the early development of the blues, but since that idea comes to me mostly from my youthful viewings of the classic Ralph Macchio film Crossroads, we should probably take it with a grain of salt, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Are you ripping that straight from Crossroads?
You
have documentation?
There is a connection between voodoo religiosity and the enslaved population of the United States and the development of the blues. So, and Legba is the deity associated with the Crossroads. Okay. So there actually is a connection. Okay. It's there.
All right.
We'll keep it floating out there in the ether. Anyhow. The blues emerged from the rural African-American population in and around a few different places in the American South, but most particularly in the region known as the Mississippi Delta. Now, I have a fun fact. Did you know that contrary to what one would probably expect, the Mississippi Delta is not, in fact, the delta of the Mississippi River?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's weird, right? It's actually a 7,000-ish square mile floodplain, which is created by the regular flooding of both the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers. It covers a swath of northwest Mississippi, but also parts of both Louisiana and Arkansas. The actual delta of the Mississippi River is about 300 miles further south. So how about them apples? Geography?
That's just infuriating.
Oh, you're upset by this?
Yeah, why would we call it the Mississippi Delta if it's not the Mississippi Delta?
I mean, I didn't
Who made this decision?
I would have to do further research
to
determine who decided to name this particular floodplain the Mississippi Delta when there's an actual Mississippi River Delta 300 miles south. Terrible, terrible decision making. Somebody's head's gonna roll. That's all I've got to say.
But they're probably already dead.
I'm sure they're long dead. Their head probably already rolled. As I believe you know, I spent some of my formative years in the great state of Arkansas. So would you agree that this essentially makes me an honorary bluesman?
Woo pigs.
Uh-huh. The blues is in my blood, John. But I should probably continue the story. Yeah. I didn't think you were going to be comfortable.
Let's keep moving.
All right. Let's just keep moving.
Pretend you didn't say that.
lived in the American South. I lived in the...
We live in the American South right now, Eric.
You're an honorary blues fan.
I do not make that claim of myself.
It's probably for the best. Okay, so the earliest developments of the blues was most especially influenced by African-American work songs and field hollers. Are you familiar with these proto-blues genres?
Fundamentally.
You know that they exist. Okay, well, let's unpack it a little bit. So African-American work songs developed during the period of enslavement between the 17th and 19th centuries. Quick PSA here and now. Human beings are fucking awful, and we should be utterly shamed to be members of a nation and of a human race that enslaved a people based on the color of their skin. Fuck that awful, awful chapter of American history. But I digress. These work songs were a cappella tunes that were developed both to synchronize movement and also to help stave off boredom and make life just a little bit more tolerable. Now, field hollers are a tiny bit different from work songs in that the principal part was sung solo, though a larger group would usually repeat a refrain. There's a call and response element in the field holler that was to be particularly important in the development of the blues and also later genres like rock and roll, heavy metal, etc. John, I use some jargon in there, and it helps to calm me if I focus on the music rather than the horror of the context in which this music was created. So could you do me a solid and briefly explain to everyone what I mean by the terms a cappella, refrain, and call and response?
So a cappella would mean just voices, no instruments.
Okay.
Refrain would be a repeating set of text and music.
Yeah, we would probably call it a chorus in modern music, yeah.
And call and response would be usually an individual saying something and then everyone else.
Amen!
That's one way you could look at it, sure.
I was responding to your call.
That was the call I was making, for sure.
I thought so. There was clear communication right there. It's very, very powerful.
Yep.
That was beautifully done. That was all great. The blues is clearly in your blood as well, no matter what you say. But are there like blues in Alaska?
I assume so. I think there's blues everywhere.
I mean, they got to be. They're depressed. They got to sing about it.
They're not depressed.
Okay. So no blues, no depression. Happy people. All right. The emergence of a much clearer blues historical record coincides with the development of audio recording and sound reproduction technologies, and particularly with the emergence of the first blues recordings in the early 1920s. Those very first blues recordings tended to be of predominantly female singers performing a somewhat citified hybrid version of the blues that incorporated influences from Tin Pan Alley, minstrelsy, and vaudeville, alongside elements of traditional rural blues. Now, John, you're a brilliant musical theater scholar, so can you tell us anything terribly insightful about these early roots of American musical theater?
Well, I mean, it's all kind of cyclical here. It's all of that early musical theater stuff was just stealing from the same elements that are going to be the foundation of rock and all of that, this blues music that we're talking about.
So the white people stealing from the black people.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and of course they do that in the most offensive, horrifying way possible.
Please
with
don't make us talk about minstrelsy.
We won't talk about minstrelsy. Suffice to say,
so bad.
It sucks,
It's so
it's a
bad.
blight on our nation's conscience, and we should all be ashamed. Now, by contrast, vaudeville and Tin Pan Alley are a little bit more healthful subjects. Tin Pan Alley, of course.
It's just the white people doing it.
Yeah.
So it's like a little bit more square and a little bit less good.
Well, and Tin Pan Alley is really a formalized place, right? It's where all
Yeah.
the songwriters are with all the performers in a sort of single location and publishers and all that in New York City. Very urban. Vaudeville's fairly urban, but it kind of tends to travel around the country.
Well, vaudeville was vaudeville was like a show type that traveled around.
Right.
A bunch of little acts all over the place, all kinds of different things.
Right, and then eventually kind of evolves into American Broadway-style musical theater as we know it.
Sort of. We're skipping a lot of steps, but yeah.
That's what we do
speaking,
here.
Yes.
We'll do that in a future episode of Heavy Metal 101 where we unpack the relationship between Broadway and heavy metal.
Let's just agree here and now to never ever do that.
We got to talk about School of Rock. We got to talk about JC Superstar. Basically, just the whole Andrew Lloyd Webber.
No, we don't have to, actually, Eric.
All right. Anywho, some of the earliest blues recordings were by singers like Bessie Smith, who was known as the Empress of the Blues, and Ma Rainey, the, quote, mother of the blues. John, would you rather be known as the Empress or the mother of a musical genre?
Empress for sure.
Yeah, it's probably...
That being said, though, I'm a bigger fan of Ma Rainey than I am Bessie Smith.
That's interesting. Okay. Nicknames be damned.
Yes.
So let's get to our first bit of assigned listening. Bessie Smith made her first recordings in February of 1923, and these included one of her biggest hits, Downhearted Blues. This record went on to sell over 2 million copies.
In 1923?
I don't know if it was that very year, but in the
like
early...
around-
Yeah.
wow,
I mean,
that
it's
isn't-
pretty amazing. In the 20s, like, people were just buying records like hotcakes.
Still, though.
Yeah, it's impressive.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So it's important. I mean, it's worth noting that this stuff was popular. It was distributed. Empress indeed. In further coolness, Downhearted Blues was written by a female composer, the band leader Cora Lovey Austin, with lyrics by a female singer-songwriter, Alberta Hunter. Music history is pretty fucking sexist, so I do love it when we have the opportunity to give the ladies their due. It's pretty great, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are a few things I want everyone to listen for before we get our music on. Number one, as is often the case, this bad boy begins with an instrumental introduction. You'll hear 4 bars of solo piano at the opening. Number two, next you're going to hear a feature that's pretty common in these classic blues records, this sort of urban style of blues. It's something which is borrowed directly from Tin Pan Alley style compositional tropes. The song proper begins with a 16-bar, non-repeating introductory verse. Once it's gone, you're never going to hear that bit again. And so about 1 minute into the song, the first of our 4 12-bar blues choruses begins. FYI, by chorus here, I mean each 12-bar unit. Now, if you listen carefully, you'll also note a slight change in the rhythmic feeling at that very same point as the music switches from kind of a ragtime quality into more of a traditional blues shuffle. Number 3. Additionally, once the song gets into those 12-bar blues choruses, you're going to hear the standard AAB form of traditional blues lyrics. John, let's just demonstrate what I mean by AAB. I'm going to yell out a letter, and then you are going to dramatically read the corresponding line of text. A!
Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days.
A!
Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days.
B.
It seems like trouble going to follow me to my grave.
And so on. Pretty clear, right? Mm-hmm. Each chorus has a different lyric, but each is constructed in that same AAB format. Okay, number 4, last thing. Listen for the freely expressive quality of Smith's voice, and particularly her use of what are called blue notes. These are notes that are slightly lowered so that they fall into the cracks between the notes of those European major minor scale types that dominate so much Western music. John, that is a lot to listen for. Is your paltry attention span up for the task at hand?
Absolutely not.
Perfect. This particular recording features Smith accompanied by pianist Clarence Williams. So, let's get into the spirit of this thing and get real downhearted. Pause the podcast, click on the link in the show notes, and give this tune a listen. John, make us deeply sad. That is, as the kids say, tasty. A delight. So good. John, what do you think of the late, great Bessie Smith?
Historically important. Mm-hmm. Cool record, historically speaking. Mm-hmm. Not something I would freely choose to listen to.
Okay, so you're not like, doesn't touch your soul?
No, not really.
Okay. Did you know Bessie Smith's work before this?
In passing, I wasn't super familiar with her.
There really were just a ton of amazing female blues singers doing extraordinary work in these early blues recordings throughout the 20s. Aside from Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, other badass, brilliant women included Ethel Waters, Clara Smith, Ida Cox, and many more. It's great stuff. That said, John, does this music scream heavy metal to you?
No.
Not so much to me either. I mean, the song does mention graves. It's kind of metal,
is a
right?
Big stretch, my man.
That's the extent of my arguments.
Okay, let's keep going.
I'd also note that the unpretty, quasi-extreme nature of the vocal delivery, it's not afraid to get dirty. It does anticipate some of what is to come in rock and roll and metal. But generally speaking, this is a pretty genteel iteration of the blues. It's fabulous, and as you said, it's really historically significant. But it probably connects a bit less directly to heavy metal than the country blues, to which we shall next be turning our attention. But wait! You waiting?
Waiting.
You're clearly waiting. Before we move along, I do want to take just a couple minutes to unpack a couple of the technical features that make the blues. We've already mentioned a few of them. Number 1, the rhythmic quality known as the blues shuffle. We mentioned that on an earlier episode. Could you remind us what that is?
I don't fully technically remember, but is it jump?
Yeah, long, short, long, short, long, short. Yeah. It's kind of like the early iteration of what would become swing and jazz. You know, it's related. Number 2, I already defined this, but remind us, what's a blue note?
It's that slightly lowered note that isn't quite a part of our formal Western musical tonality.
It's an in-between thing, but it's very it kind of
evocative.
Yeah, it's powerful. It kind of like grabs your attention. You know, this is very good work you're doing. You should consider studying music. I think you've got potential.
I don't know. I've heard it doesn't pay very well.
It does not pay very well. Amen, sister. Elements of call and response, borrowed from the aforementioned field holler, which will eventually develop into, for instance, the dichotomy between the riff and the lick that's going to become so important to rock and roll, and later to our much beloved heavy metal. You know, dun dun dun, ba-da-da, ba-da-da, bum bum bum, ba-da-da, ba-da-da. Like that.
The what?
Bum bum bum, ba-da-da, ba-da-da, bum bum bum, ba-da-da, ba-da-da.
Okay.
Yeah, you got it? I could do it again. No.
Would you?
No, it's too much. It's too much. It's just too much. And one more important thing. The 12-bar blues. Now, I mentioned the 12-bar blues before we listened to Downhearted Blues. I think it's important here that we take just a moment to consider what we mean by a bar. Maybe everyone listening doesn't know that. So, John, blues is typically in what we would call a 4/4. Could you demonstrate to the nice people how we might count 2 consecutive bars of 4/4 time?
So 2 measures of 4/4 time would be counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 2. 2, 3, 4.
That was perfect.
Thank you. I've worked pretty hard on this music thing.
I have to admit, I never understood it until just now.
Well, I'm glad that we could come to this moment of realization.
Yeah, that's great. Great. In 12-bar blues, all we do is we count to 4 12 times, completing the unit that is known as a chorus. Then we start the process all over again. There is a specific harmonic pattern or a set of underlying musical chords that goes along with this cycle. It's as follows. The first 4 bars are on the home chord, known more technically as the tonic or 1. Bars 5 and 6 move to the subdominant or 4 chord, before returning back to the tonic chord for bars 7 and 8. On bars 9 and 10, we move to the dominant or 5 chord, often adding a 7th. Give it a little color. Ooh. Then we move to the comforts of the home chord for the final 2 bars, 11 and 12. Moving on. So here is where chronology gets a bit wonky, so please bear with me. John, are you prepared to bear with me?
Time is an illusion.
I like it. Okay. Chronologically, the first blues recordings were indeed in that Tin Pan Alley-informed classic blues style sung by female vaudeville-type singers like Bessie Smith that we just discussed. However, this music was actually inspired by what was an earlier blues idiom that is often known as the country blues. In reality, this was the first type of blues to develop. It's just that none of it was recorded until a few years after that first swath of classic blues recordings was made. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. More importantly, this is where the true roots of so much popular music of the 20th century, including Satan Be Praised heavy metal, came from. John, are you ready to take my hand and go on down to the crossroads?
We're not going to touch.
It's going to get creepy.
Okay. It'd only be creepier if we touched.
Kind of hurts my feelings, but okay. Some of the earliest country blues recordings were made in the later 1920s, including work by your favorite, Blind Lemon Jefferson, whose first records were released in 1926, and who was really the first true recording star to emerge from the country blues. So, John, you are not a Blind Lemon Jefferson fan?
No, not particularly.
I think you should be. I think it's some fabulous fucking music. Jefferson recorded a total of 79 songs between 1925 and his death in 1929. It's all pretty damn great, but for interested parties, that Black Snake Moan is a great place to start. That's what I put on your playlist. It's got lots of naughty sexual double entendre, which we love here at Heavy Metal 101, right?
The use of we is liberal there, but I know you do.
I do. It's fabulous. Just fabulous. Another crucial early figure who I did not include on your playlist, although I wanted to, I just didn't want to, turn you off. Charlie Patton, who among other things was known for a particularly aggressive percussive style of guitar playing and harsh growling vocals. Now, John, is it just me, Or do these sound like attributes one might eventually associate with heavy metal music?
I mean, I guess technically speaking, ugly sounds and bad singing do tend to show up in heavy metal a lot.
I'll take it. I want to punch you, but I'll take it. Indeed. So one can get a sense of Patton's very cool, very visceral approach via his Down the Dirt Road Blues from 1929. It is very awesome music. However, great as Jefferson and Patton were, there really is no one artist who screams roots of heavy metal quite like the great master of the country blues, Robert motherfucking Johnson. John, I think it's evil story time. Shall we hear an evil story?
I hope everyone is emotionally prepared for what has just been asked of me.
All right, in my estimation, everyone should grab some hot cocoa or maybe a stiff whiskey, and we're all going to prepare to listen to a spooky, spooky story as told by John.
A long, long time ago in the one-horse town that was Hazelhurst, Mississippi, a baby boy was born to one Julia Major Dodds. The year was 1911, and that baby boy would one day come to be known as Robert Leroy Johnson. Before long, the family would leave Little Hazelhurst for the bright lights and cool blues of Memphis, Tennessee, where young Robert would spend his formative years. It was in Memphis that he first developed a deep love for the blues and other popular musical styles of the day. He also first learned to play the harmonica and the jar harp. After 8 years in the big city, Robert and his mother relocated to the Abbey and Leatherman plantation just outside of Robinsonville, Mississippi, a small town in the Mississippi Delta. The next major event in Robert's all-too-brief life was in 1929, when he married 16-year-old Virginia Travis. Alas, this marriage was not to last long. Just 1 year later, both Virginia and their baby died in childbirth. Robert would never be the same. Virginia's relatives were later to describe the event as a divine punishment, retribution from above for Robert's decision to sing devil's music. Following this devastating event, Robert decided to pursue a new life as an itinerant blues musician. Remembering back to this time many years later, the legendary blues musician Son House, who had himself relocated to Robinsonville in 1930, recalled Johnson as a, quote, little boy, who was a competent harmonica player but a genuinely terrible guitarist. This was about to change. It was around this time that Johnson left Robinsonville for a period of time that some say lasted just 6 months, while others suggest it was as long as 3 years. Regardless of just how long Johnson was away, it was during this lost period that a defining mythos was born. Legend has it that during the time in question, Johnson, who was desperate to become a true master of the blues guitar, was instructed to bring his instrument to a crossroads at midnight. There he was met by the devil. The devil took his guitar, tuned it up, played a few tunes, then handed it back to Robert. And just like that, he was now the greatest living blues musician. Robert Johnson had exchanged his soul in order to become the master of the blues. He would be dead within 8 years, but would remain an icon forevermore.
John! I hate to interrupt this deeply beautiful recitation, but what are your thoughts? The documented truth of the matter is indeed that following his extended absence, the very next time Robert Johnson appeared back in Robinsonville before Son and others, he had become a true master of the blues guitar, seemingly out of nowhere. Do you think he obtained this mastery through a deal with the devil?
So there are 2 possible ways this went down. Possibility number 1, he exchanged his soul with the devil to become a master of the blues.
Okay.
Possibility number 2, he disappeared for at least 3 months and just practiced. Now, knowing musicians as I do, I think option 1 is far more likely.
Okay. Well, for the record, there is indeed an alternative explanation that has been presented. It's a bit more prosaic, but it's still actually pretty nifty. You want to hear it?
I suppose.
Ah, good. So apparently, Johnson left Robinsonville and ended up in a town called Martinsville, where he met a talented blues musician named Ike Zimmerman.
That seems unlikely.
Ike Zimmerman was not Jewish, despite the surname. I did look it up. He was a nice African-American fellow. In truth is nearly as cool as fiction news. Zimmerman apparently taught Johnson to play blues guitar during nightly midnight visits to a local graveyard. This version of events may not directly involve Satan, but it's still pretty fucking metal, right?
That seems even less likely.
Oh, because it involves practicing.
Well, because, why do you need to meet at midnight in a graveyard?
Apparently it was quiet and they could focus.
Okay.
All right. Well, pardon the interruption. I'd like you to please finish your lovely narrative. I am all ears.
Now truly the king of the Delta Blues, Johnson would spend the years between approximately 1932 and 1938 traveling around the country searching out gigs, women, food, and shelter wherever he could find them. He traveled primarily across the Mississippi Delta region, but also ended up as far afield as Chicago, Texas, New York, and Canada. He could often be found playing for tips on street corners or playing a set at the local juke joint. However, his legend would never have obtained the status that it has if we didn't have a recorded legacy, if ever so tantalizingly brief, for us to remember him. Johnson's first recording session was held on November 23rd through the 25th in 1936 in room number 414 of the Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, Texas. He was recorded by producer Don Law. Included in this session were his legendary Crossroad Blues and the one minor hit single of his lifetime, Terraplane Blues, which would sell approximately 10,000 copies. The second and final recording session, also with Don Law, was held in a makeshift studio in a sweltering warehouse in Dallas on June 19th through the 20th of 1937. Famously, some of his most unsettling and introspective tunes were recorded during this session, including Hellhound on My Trail and Me and the Devil Blues. The details of the story of Robert Johnson's death on August 16th, 1938 in Greenwood, Mississippi are a bit murky. The general consensus is that he probably died after drinking poisoned whiskey, perhaps as the result of a feud over a woman. Apparently, his death was quite slow and quite painful. Robert Johnson was just 27 years old when he died, the first inductee into the fabled 27 Club. His entire recorded discography consists of just 29 songs, and yet, his iconic status would only grow and grow and grow.
And now you know the rest of the story. I'm Paul Harvey. Good day.
Bravo! Bravo! John, that was heart-rendingly beautiful.
Thank you.
You really are a gentleman and a scholar. Okay, let's hear some music, shall we?
Let's do.
Ooh. I'm ready. There are plenty of Robert Johnson songs that help.
Actually, there are 29.
Well, yes. You're such a fucker. All right, there's not that many Robert Johnson songs, but basically all of them help to lay the groundwork for rock and roll and heavy metal to come. But the gothic trifecta of Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, and Me and the Devil Blues have the most darkly direct connection to the legacy of heavy metal. Each of these tracks are extraordinary miniature masterpieces with genuinely unsettling subtext, but I decided to go with the haunting Me and the Devil Blues for this assigned listening.
That's a good one.
Yes, it is a good one. There's a number of things everyone should listen for. 1. Note the straightforward overall form. It's just an introduction, 4 blues choruses, and a brief tag. 2. Note the general adherence to both the AAB lyrical formatting and the harmonic and rhythmic language of the classic 12-bar blues. Both elements see some amount of subtle modification herein. Particularly, as is common in the country blues, you'll find that Johnson periodically adds or drops a beat here and there as he deems fit. 3. Note the flexible use of his voice, which generally possesses a wailing tenor quality. Note also his frequent use of microtones. These are pitches like blue notes that fall in between the cracks of the half steps of the conventional Western tuning system. Also, you should notice his use of various alternate timbres. He switches into falsetto sometimes, and also spoken word on some of the lines. 4. Note the resigned quality of this dark, dark lyric. The words to this song are not very nice at all. 5. Finally, note the guitar playing. It jumps back and forth between a highly rhythmic accompaniment and bursts of lead playing in a considerably higher register. It's call and response. Upon hearing Johnson's recordings for the first time, Keith Richards famously asked, "Who's the other guy playing with him?" Who indeed? John, let us go deep, deep down into the mire with Robert Johnson and the Me and the Devil Blues. Okay, tell it to me straight. John, what did you think of Robert Johnson and the Me and the Devil Blues?
That's fucking great.
Oh,
That's great.
here, see, look at this. We're finding, my heart is aflutter. We're finding this connection. I see, it's like I'm looking at you across the room. Our eyes meet. We have sparks flying.
The always in sunny Delphia, always sunny in Philadelphia meme here.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
I too, I've just always found this music powerfully affecting. There's just something about Robert Johnson's recordings. It just fills my heart with a gladness that's very similar to the way I feel when I listen to music by Bach or Death. It's just transcendently great fucking music, right?
It's great.
Yeah, it is great. This is also unquestionably the true roots of what would eventually become rock and roll and later our beloved heavy metal. It all starts here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
Yeah.
By nature of like the way history unfolds in a linear path, sure.
It's just a straight line from Robert Johnson to death. Now, before we spend just a bit of time discussing the particularly unique relationship between heavy metal and the blues more directly, I think we need to take just one more stop on this magical history tour of ours. You see, at this point, we've collected ourselves the devil and the macabre antisocial lyrical themes. We've got a guitar-based music comprised of alternating riffs and licks. We've also got some early iterations of the sorts of extreme, unpretty vocal styles that will become so important in heavy metal. But we are missing something. John, what are we still missing? What essential element of heavy metal music are we still missing heretofore in our narrative?
I'm not sure.
It's so exciting! My friend, we are missing electricity. And for that, we're going to have to travel north. Due north. John, do you have a winter coat handy?
Eric, it is like 80 degrees here today. I do not.
Well, it's going to get frigid. It's going to get windy. Because we are off to the great city of Chicago. Welcome, everybody, to the mean streets of Chicago, circa 1943.
Hell yeah.
John, have you been to Chicago?
I have.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I spent a brief amount of time there, but my time was well spent. I went to the Russian tea house and had amazing dumplings.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah.
It's really nice. It's a nice town. As a former New Yorker, I have some serious questions about their taste in pizza. But
That's valid.
Yeah, it's a little weird. But the Windy City certainly did play a pivotal role in the further development of the blues, and particularly the transition from Delta blues into the electric and jump style blues that were the direct forerunners of rock and roll. John, who is your favorite Chicago style blues musician?
I just want to say the Blues Brothers. I'm sorry.
The Blues Brothers they're pretty cool. I like the Blues Brothers.
My favorite
I'll
movie
accept
growing
it.
up.
It's a great movie. It's a really, really good movie. All right, anyway, mine happens to be a fellow who was born McKinley Morganfield on April 4th, 1913, just outside of Clarksdale, Mississippi. Now, how about Clarksdale? Have you ever been to Clarksdale?
I have not been to Clarksdale.
Nor have I, but interestingly, I did attend a Jewish summer camp in Utica, Mississippi in my youth.
Utica, Mississippi?
Yeah, Utica, Mississippi.
Huh.
Yeah. Before we go any further, allow me to provide just a bit of detail about the Chicago electric blues of the mid-20th century. This was a post-war urban blues tradition and part of a direct evolutionary line from the rural Mississippi Delta tradition. This is in part an accident of geography. Chicago was the final stop of the Illinois Central Railroad line, which ran up from the Mississippi Delta through the Midwestern United States. As such, Chicago ended up being where a large portion of the African Americans who were migrating from the South to the North in the mid-20th century ended up. Among the musical styles that emerged as a result of this migration was this grittier, noisier take on the Delta blues. One of the most famous practitioners of this idiom was indeed our good pal McKinley Morganfield, who most listeners and you will likely know by his nom de plume, Muddy Waters. Now that's a familiar name to you, right? Yeah, I thought it might be. Waters relocated from the Mississippi Delta to Chicago in 1943. While he was out and about playing the clubs in Chicago, Waters found that the crowds were so noisy it was necessary to switch from acoustic to electric guitar simply in order to be heard. Eventually, he would put together a dance band which included an additional electric guitar, piano, bass, harmonica, and drums. Waters played freely with the timbral possibilities inherent to the electric guitar, exploring early aesthetic uses of distortion and feedback, two of heavy metal's principal building blocks. He also sang in a rough-hewn style and wrote songs about anger and pain and also good old-fashioned sex. John, are you a big fan of music about sex?
Sure.
Yeah. It's fun to have music about sex. What about when composers like Richard Strauss emulate orgasms in their orchestral compositions? That seems like it'd be right up your alley.
Sure.
You like the Sinfonia Domestica?
I mean, not my favorite.
No, it's not really that good a piece, actually.
It's kind of long.
It does have an orgasm in it, though. That's kind of fun.
Okay.
So, John and sex music. It's like peanut butter and chocolate. Is that fair?
Not jelly?
Oh. You prefer peanut butter and jelly to peanut? I mean, there's very different combinations. All right, peanut butter and jelly. That seems more sexually uncomfortable to me. I'd like to move on now.
Eric, you brought us into these waters. You're going to drown in them, okay?
I wasn't expecting it to take this dark turn.
Jelly? Jelly was the dark turn for you. Of all the shit we've talked about in however many episodes of this we've done, it was the combination of peanut butter, jelly, and sex that really threw you off the deep end.
Apparently, I have some trauma that I need to work through.
Well, I'm going to let you unpack that in your own time.
Okay, well, moving back to the music, for our last blues example of this episode, we're going to take a gander at the wonderful Hoochie Coochie Man. This tune was actually originally written by the in-house composer for the Chicago Blues recording institution known as Chess Records. The composer of this song was a fellow named Willie Dixon. It was most famously recorded by Muddy Waters in 1954 and was one of his biggest hits, reaching number 3 on the R&B charts. A few things to listen for. Number 1, the increased volume and intensity that the electric blues band allows for. Number 2, the free use of harsh and distorted tone colors throughout. And number 3, the pounding intensity of the beat. Now that all sounds pretty rockin', don't you agree?
Sure.
Yeah. It's also probably worth pointing out that this is a 16-bar blues and not the more traditional 12-bar formulation. Waters employs the use of a technique called stop time over the first 8 bars of each sequence, which acts like a verse section. The lyrics change each time it occurs. The second 8 bars of each 16-bar sequence establish a more regular driving pulse and repeat the same lyrics each time they occur, thereby functioning as the chorus of the song. The lyrics are also well worth a careful listen and show just the sort of machismo for which heavy metal will eventually become well known. The singer is bragging about his superior brains, his power, and his sexual prowess, and that's the good stuff. Let's give it a listen. John! I'm very curious. What did the gypsy woman tell your mother when you were born?
It was more just like a long, drawn-out sigh.
I was kind of expecting incoherent shrieks of horror. Okay, more importantly, do you think we've made some headway in our journey from the Tin Pan Alley-informed classic blues of the very early days of recorded music through to the proto-rock Chicago-style blues of Muddy Waters towards establishing a somewhat clear familial relationship between the blues and heavy metal?
I mean, I'm with you on the through line to proto-rock, and I'll even take it to rock and roll very, very clearly and very easily. I just feel like you're just sort of arbitrarily jumping over a whole patch of musical history to get to heavy metal because that's what you care about.
Right. There's a missing link. I think we can both agree there's a middle part of this story that we're missing between this late electric blues.
God, are you setting up another episode?
Which we will cover on a future...
Now shut up! Let me say this. I will say, actually, the one thing that you have highlighted here in this episode that I think does more directly connect the blues and a musical genre like heavy metal is the timbral quality of the singing, because that kind of goes away in rock and roll. Rock and roll is all a little bit, I mean, not all. You can't say it's something so general about it.
I mean, you get people like Little Richard who have this more extreme vocal style.
But like generally, a lot of it is more straightforward singing as opposed to the sort of expressive quality that you see in blues singing. So I will allow you that one concession.
All right, I appreciate this little opening, this little glimpse of sunlight through the cracks. All right, well, yes, we are not talking today about the very important formative influence of rock and roll and heavy metal. And yes, much to your chagrin, we will eventually have to do just
Well, at
that.
least we're going to do a fucking relevant episode.
Will that make you happy?
No, but I'll participate anyway.
That's what I like. Even if you're pissed off, at least you're here. You're talking the talk. You're walking the walk. All right. Well, I appreciate your forbearance. Frankly, I think it is long past the time on this heavy metal podcast that we actually talk just a wee tiny little bit about some actual heavy metal.
Are we going to talk about Metallica?
We're not going to fucking talk about Metallica. God bless. We need
Listeners, my hope is that by nagging him enough, we will actually never discuss Metallica on this
we're gonna talk about
podcast.
Metallica. We've got it all lined up. Look, we need to be approaching the end point for the day, but I do want to spend a few minutes looking more directly at how the blues and heavy metal history are specifically, interestingly entwined with each other. So, John, I have a heavy metal trivia question for you, and I think you know the answer. Are you ready?
Okay.
Who was the first heavy metal band?
I mean, as defined by who?
Me!
You think it's Black Sabbath.
Thank you. That's all I care about. All right, we're done. Good night, fucker.
I didn't say you were wrong. I'm just merely implying that this is perhaps a subjective question.
It is, and that's fair, and I'm all for the subjectivity. But for our particular historical through line, I think we've established that we are okay with the idea of Black Sabbath as the first heavy metal band.
Again, a liberal use of the word we, but fine.
Okay. Now, as you may recall, Black Sabbath did not start off as a heavy metal band.
Accurate.
They didn't even start off as Black Sabbath. Now, we're going to go back a little further than we did in our first Heavy Metal 101 episode. In 1968, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, and John Michael Ozzy Osbourne formed a band that was then briefly called the Polka Tulk Blues Band. I don't think we mentioned that back when we first discussed the origins of Sabbath.
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, how do you like that first draft of the band's name?
That's rough.
Yeah, it's
Polka Tulk does not roll off the tongue.
No, it's hard to say, it's hard to look at. It's not great. So the original mission statement of the band, at least, was very clear from that name. This first iteration of Sabbath was indeed an electric blues band. Actually, at that time, they were a six-piece and also included a slide guitarist and a saxophone player. It wasn't long before they streamlined down to the four-piece ensemble we know and love under the moniker Earth. And that's about where we picked up the story back in episode 1.
It's crazy that somehow Earth is an improvement as a band name.
Yeah, right? See, we thought that name sucked.
Yeah.
And that name sucks way less than the
So much less.
Now, just briefly, it's kind of nice to think back on our Salad Days, episode 1. Do you remember those golden years of the Heavy Metal 101 podcast?
Sure.
It was nice, right? We were so young, so innocent.
I feel like it was not that long ago.
Huh. Seems like an age
Pretty sure
ago.
it was like last year. I think we've been doing this roughly a year.
Feels like forever, but in the best possible way. Wouldn't you agree?
That's your perspective.
Anywho, point of all this is that the first metal band actually began life as a blues band. Heavy metal has been shot through with the blues since the very, very start. And even once they changed their name and their aesthetic focus in 1969, Black Sabbath still very much had one foot in blues rock, as you may well recall from listening to their self-titled debut. Yes, indeed. So songs like The Wizard and Wicked World, they're really just blues rock on steroids. Of course, the same thing could be said about much of the oeuvre of formative, influential 1970s bands like Aerosmith and AC/DC. It's heavy blues rock. So I think we've clearly established that heavy metal's roots were indeed well nourished by the blues. Does that seem like a reasonable supposition to you?
Sure.
Okay. Good. That said, there's a generally, if not universally, accepted thesis that heavy metal's maturation and increasing distance from hard rock over the course of the 1970s and particularly into the 1980s had a lot to do with the genre shedding much of this blues influence. Now, I might argue that this was more of an aesthetic repurposing of those elements than a true departure from the blues, but that's a more involved discussion than I think we really need to have at the moment. Suffice it to say, I think you'll agree that the heavy metal of the early 1980s that we've explored this season has generally less of a surface blues influence than the heavy metal of the 1970s did, no?
Yes.
Look at you. You're all qualified to intelligently answer that question. You've come so far.
I said the word yes.
I'm proud of you, buddy. So here's the thing. Although much of the 1980s was indeed spent with artists innovating increasingly outside of metal's origins in blues rock, in the latter part of that decade, something strange started to happen. Most particularly in the field of glam metal, bands started increasingly seeing the blues as providing a sort of rootsy musical credibility that they were otherwise lacking. I think of a band like Cinderella. John, are you a Cinderella fan?
I've never heard of the band Cinderella.
You literally heard them. We talked about them before the podcast because they were on your playlist.
Yeah, but I mean, like, okay.
Oh, like all right, outside of the play. You've never heard of them at all?
No.
Wow. You don't know what you got till it's gone? That powerful power ballad?
No.
That was a big hit.
Okay.
Oh, all right.
When?
The 1980s. Yeah. They were a great band from the lovely state of Pennsylvania. Their debut, 1986's Night Songs, was pretty much just a high-quality, straight-ahead, glammy pop metal album. However, by the 1988 release of their sophomore album, Long Cold Winter, they had shifted to a much more rootsy blues rock / glam metal hybrid. This was really common in the pop metal of the very late 1980s, when I think a lot of bands felt that wearing their classic rock and blues influences on their sleeves was their paths to respectability. Cinderella was actually pretty good at walking that particularly fine line, but by the early 90s, bluesy hair metal had become more or less a subgenre all its own and is not really an especially good one. At the same time, the 90s marked a time where a variety of other heavy metal bands started to find some genuinely interesting ways to reincorporate blues elements into heavy metal without sounding like total posers. I think particularly of an album like Danzig 2 Lucifuge, by the great Danzig, which is one of my personal favorite bluesy metal albums of all time. It's very cool, it's very creative, and it is super bluesy. In the 21st century, lots of interesting metal bands have successfully and authentically incorporated blues influence into their work. For instance, bands like Clutch, Witch Mountain, Goatsnake, etc. John, what's your favorite 21st century bluesy metal band?
I'm pretty sure you made all of those up.
What's your favorite of those names?
Witch Mountain for sure.
Oh yeah, I thought that's a good one. I like that name too. Good band. Well, for our last assigned listening of the day, I want to take a look at a track by one of my own very favorite contemporary syntheses of blues and traditional African American music more broadly, and heavy metal. It all comes together in a particularly interesting project to emerge in recent years called Zeal and Ardor, which was created by the Swiss-American musician Manuel Gagnon. Gagnon was born to an African-American mother and a Swiss father, and in Zeal and Ardor, he melds elements of black metal, Delta blues, gospel, and other influences into a shockingly effective stylistic gumbo. Gagnon shows a particularly impressive ability to reimagine the relationship between metal and the blues and other elements derived from African-American musical traditions. In embarking on this project, Gagnon posited the following question, quote, "What if American slaves had embraced Satan instead of Jesus?" End quote. John, you've been curious about just this sort of thing for years, no? Did I catch you off guard with that question?
Pondering alternative religious possibilities has long been one of my hobbies.
All right, yeah, see? Well, now's your chance to get a sense of what that might have sounded like musically. For our final assigned listening, we're going to check out the phantasmic In Ashes from Zeal and Ardor's exquisite 2016 debut, Devil Is Fine. John, do the thing! John! How fucking cool is that band?
So I have to say, understanding the mission of the album and putting that in some historical context made it more interesting.
I can see that.
This is not music that appeals to me.
No, it doesn't seem like your type of thing. It's very, very noisy and heavy and stuff. But a really interesting take, I think, on that. It's
I would agree.
Yeah. Zeal and ardor provide us with a complete reevaluation of the possibilities inherent in the relationship between metal, the blues, and traditional African American music writ large. I really love this band. So I think we've done a reasonably reasonable job of establishing a through-line relationship between heavy metal and its most crucial ancestor, the blues, though we have skipped a bit of middle ground, the whole rock and roll into hard rock business, blah, 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 we'll get there.
Blah, blah, blah.
It's there, waiting for us to unpack. I'm excited about that. What do you think? Do you see that there is indeed a connection between the blues and heavy metal that, of course, goes through rock and roll, but also there's some other relationships in there?
Eric, I've already made my one concession for this episode. You're not going to get a second one out of me.
I was all excited. Our eyes beating across the room again. Fuck. All right. Well, from metal's prehistoric times, back when Black Sabbath ruled the earth and incorporated the harmonica and a bluesy shuffle into their early heavy metal, all the way through to Zeal and Ardor and other contemporary groups, the blues has provided a nearly infinite wellspring of influence and inspiration for heavy metal bands far and wide. Much and many thanks to early blues masters like Bessie Smith, Robert Johnson, and Muddy Waters for helping to make all of this possible. John, do you have any further questions or comments about the ancestral relationship between heavy metal and the blues?
No.
You're good?
Let's just go listen to more Robert Johnson.
Okay. I can think of worse ways to pass the time, definitely. We've covered a lot of ground today. How about we wrap things up by reminding the nice people how they can contact us?
Hey everyone, you can reach us via email at heavymetal101podcast@gmail.com. Or you can leave us a voice message at anchor.fm/heavymetal101podcast. Have you checked that voicemail yet, Eric?
I tried to check it, and there didn't appear to be any messages.
All right. Or you can find us on social media through Facebook at Heavy Metal 101 Podcast, Twitter at Heavy_101, or on Instagram at Heavy Metal 101 Podcast.
Bonus points to anyone who sends us a bluesy little ditty about John and his relationship with heavy metal. I think that could be a real nice thing, no?
Yeah, if someone writes a song about my feelings about heavy metal, that would be amazing.
It would be pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
We will absolutely post and share that song.
Oh, absolutely. Please remember to kindly rate and review us on your favorite podcast listening applications if you enjoy the show, and thanks oh so very much for listening. Bye!